Hello, class. It is time for Read Aloud. We are now on Chapter 7 of A Week in the Woods by Andrew Clements. Tessa's joined me today to help me out with the Read Aloud. We'll see if she can sit through the whole chapter. It's a little bit above her age level, but that's okay. She will be a wonderful audience member. So here we go. Chapter 7 is called Skirmish. With 4 minutes to go before the last bell of the day, the kids in room 7 were pretending to read their science books, and Mr. Maxwell was pretending to clean up the lab station. The kids were actually fidgeting and whispering and counting down the seconds to the weekend, and Mr. Maxwell was actually processing new information about Mark Chelmsley. He reasoned his way through the results of his experiment. What had he just learned by putting some pressure on the boy? Well, for one thing, that slacker attitude had to be an act. This kid was plenty bright, maybe too bright for his own good. Maybe he should have been put into the gifted program. Probably ahead of most of the town kids, and not just in science class either. Probably bored as well as spoiled. And the kid had spirit too. Got pushed into a corner, and what did he do? He pushed back, that's what. Spilled the beans about the hydrogen and the Hindenburg. Maybe a bit of a mean streak there somewhere too. Seemed to enjoy spoiling the show, being the know-it-all. Mean? Maybe. But maybe something else too. As he put the acid on a shelf in the locked storage cabinet, Mr. Maxwell remembered there was something he needed to tell Mark. He had some good news for Mark, and he was glad, because he wanted to keep after this boy, keep trying to reach him. He had recently added a new item to the bottom of his Week in the Woods checklist. Give registration packet to Mark Chelmsley. The other fifth graders had gotten theirs back in January. He had put a complete packet in his desk drawer 2 days ago, all stapled and ready with Mark's name written on it. Mr. Maxwell had been waiting for the right moment to talk to Mark and take him aside and tell him a little bit about the program, maybe get him excited about it and give him the information sheets. And 10 seconds before the bell rang, Mr. Maxwell decided that the right moment had arrived. A few quick strides took him to the back of the room. Mark? The boy jerked his head around and flinched as Mr. Maxwell said his name. Then the bell sounded, and Mr. Maxwell saw Mark flinch again. Speaking loudly enough to be heard above the sudden burst of noise in the room, he said, Mark, stay here for a second, will you? I've got something you need to take home this weekend. For a second, Mark looked like he was going to bolt out of his seat and dash for the door. Then he relaxed a little, stood up slowly, and grabbed his backpack. Just come up to my desk, Mr. Maxwell said, leading the way. This will only take a minute or two. Mark walked to the front of the room and stopped about 2 feet to the left of Mr. Maxwell's desk. The teacher rustled through some papers and then looked over at him with a smile. Have you heard the kids talking about A Week in the Woods? Mark looked at him blankly. Haven't heard a thing about it? Mark's face remained expressionless and he shook his head. Wow, it's a week when the whole fifth grade goes to a state park campground together. And it's like a campout, except we spend some time each day doing science and ecology observations and some other assignments and experiments too. But mostly it's a lot of fun. Here! And Mr. Maxwell held out a set of stapled pages. Mark took them and glanced down. The cover had some student artwork of cabins and trees and mountains surrounding the title of the program. We've been doing this here in Whitson for a lot of years now, and all the kids have a great time, and so do the teachers, parents too. We always need all the helpers and chaperones we can get. If your folks wanted to help out, they'd be welcome. When he said that, Mr. Maxwell thought he saw a flash in the boy's eyes. Mark said, Anything else? No, that's it really. The packet has a lot of good information. A permission form you need to get signed and bring back, all the dates, things you need to bring with you, things not to bring. As he kept talking, Mark began flipping through the pages. The school provides all the meals. There are boys and girls bunkhouses, and the restrooms and the shower facilities are almost as nice as home. It's really a great experience. Any questions you want to ask about any of it? I've been at this a few years, so... Mark looked up from the packet and said, Does everyone have to go? Have to go? Mr. Maxwell was stunned. Well, I mean, everyone always does. It's really a lot of fun. I'm sure you're going to have a great time, Mark. So everyone has to go? Mark asked again. Mr. Maxwell stood up quickly and his chair banged back against the chalk rail. I guess I haven't explained it well enough, Mark. This is the best week of the whole school year. Every kid who wasn't sicker than a dog has always been dying to go. Mr. Maxwell was leaning forward and he felt like he was talking too loud and too fast, but he couldn't help it. I mean, don't you see? It's like a whole week of playing hooky. So why wouldn't a kid want to go? But if you're going to put it that way, there are assignments every day and there are grades for those assignments. And if you want to think of it that way, then yes, every fifth grader has to go. There was silence for a second, and then Mark said, unless he gets sick. Mr. Maxwell clenched his jaw and glared down at Mark. Right, unless he gets sick. Mark wasn't flinching now. He looked Mr. Maxwell in the eye and asked, anything else that you need to give me? With all his heart, Mr. Maxwell wanted to give this smart-faced kid a serious piece of his mind, but he managed to take a deep breath and said, no, that's it. If you or your parents have any questions, let me know. Have a good weekend. And he turned abruptly, grabbed an eraser, and began sweeping it across the chalkboard with sharp, jerky strokes. He heard Mark's footsteps out in the hall. Mr. Maxwell didn't turn around. He kept on erasing. He heard the fire door clang shut. By then the chalkboard was completely clean, but Mr. Maxwell didn't stop erasing until he'd gone over the whole thing 2 more times. When Mark came out the front door of the school, the buses were just pulling away. He walked over to where Leon was parked, yanked the passenger door open, dropped his book bag onto the floorboard, climbed in, pulled the heavy door shut, and fastened his seatbelt. Leon nodded and smiled, but didn't offer a greeting. He had learned that right after school was not a good time to chat. The door locks clicked as he put the car into gear and drove out of the school driveway. Mark took a deep breath and settled back into the seat. Music from a dozen speakers filled the space around him. Jazz. Leon always listened to jazz after school. Mark looked past the wipers at the falling snow. He sat forward so he could see better. There was no wind, and the snow was forming little piles on the limbs of the trees and on the telephone wires beside the road. And as he began to think about the snow building up on the hills around his house and on the roof of the barn, the school week began to melt away. Halfway home, Mark thought, Saturday and Sunday, 2 whole days. And he smiled to himself, his first real smile of the day. They drove the 5 miles past the west edge of town. When Leon turned into the long drive, Mark was caught off guard again by the beauty of the place. It wasn't the weathered house or the dull red barn or the dark rock walls that framed the frozen pond farther down the hillside. It wasn't the stand of pine trees along the ridge to the west, or the top of Mount Washington far to the northeast, hidden now by the snow clouds, but still there. It wasn't any one thing. It was everything all together that dazzled him. As Leon stopped the car to wait for the electric opener to lift the door, yes, I see. As Leon stopped the car to wait for the electric opener to lift the door, Mark jumped out, grabbed his backpack, scooted around behind the car, and dashed for the mudroom door. Thanks for the ride, Leon. Leon smiled and waved, then eased the heavy car forward into the garage. He chuckled to himself, nodding. He knew the change in Mark's spirits weren't just because it was Friday afternoon. Leon had seen it happen day after day. He looked forward to it now like a daily miracle. Every afternoon it was as if a bitter old man came limping out of the school and crawled into the car. It was only a 15-minute drive, but by the time they reached home, that angry little man became a completely different person. Mark turned into a boy again. All right, I hope you enjoyed Chapter 7. I hope you could hear all of it too. Tessa got a little talkative for some of that, but Tessa, can you say bye-bye? Bye-bye. We'll see you later.